around there now, Mr. Holmes, I know you weren't there, but at the time, but in September 2015, then Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, Obama appointed career ambassador. I'm sure you know him.
I do.
Credible?
Yes.
Successful ambassador, I'm sure. He called for an investigation into Zlochevsky, the owner of Burisma, President of Burisma. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. Did you know about Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Kent's concerns about the potential conflict of interest with Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma?
I would defer to George Kent, who was involved at the time and is an expert on those issues.
As you know, that the financial records show that this Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, routed more than $3 million to the American accounts of Hunter Biden?
I've heard that.
Were you familiar with that, Dr. Hill?
Only from newspaper reports.
Okay. Did you know that Burisma's American, and this is back to you, Mr. Holmes. Did you know that Burisma's American legal representatives met with Ukrainian officials just days after the vice president forced the firing of the country's chief prosecutor?
No.
Did you know that Burisma's American lawyers tried to secure a meeting with the new state prosecutor the same day the predecessor, Victor Shokin's firing was announced?
No.
Did you know that Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Poroshenko at least 3 times in February 2016, shortly after the president and owner of Burisma's home was raided on February 2nd by the state prosecutor's office?
No.
Did you know that Devin Archer and Hunter Biden reached out to the Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, shortly after the raid on Burisma?
No.
So, Dr. Hill, did you know about, I don't want to go through and ask all those questions over again.
I also did not know. That's
You did
correct.
not know about any of those?
I did not know, no.
Okay. So, you obviously know that the president had concerns about Burisma, had concerns about 2016 election meddling by the Ukrainians. When you were in there as the head of the Ukraine desk, did you ever raise any of these? Did you ever brief the president or raise it up to Ambassador Bolton about any concerns through 2017 and 18 that concerned 2016 election meddling or Burisma concerns?
The whole briefing process didn't really work in the way that you're suggesting there. So if the president had asked about any of this information, it would have been provided for him. Just to be very clear, Ukraine was not a top foreign policy priority in this period, in the same way that many other issues that we could talk about, from Syria to Turkey and others, are. So there weren't that frequent briefings on Ukraine. The briefings would take place when there was a scheduled meeting with a Ukrainian head of state. Mm-hmm. And as we know, there haven't been too many of those. So
but as far as you know, you did no briefings, no papers, answered no questions as it relates to the 2016 election or Burisma during your time there?
No, I did not know.
Okay. Mr. Castro.
And Dr. Hill, you told us during your deposition that indeed that there are perceived conflict of interest troubles when the child of a government official is involved with something that government official has an official policy role in, correct?
I think any family member of any member of the U.S. government, Congress, or the Senate is open to all kinds of questions about optics and of perhaps undue outside influence if they take part in any kind of activity that could be misconstrued as being related to their parent or other family member's work. So as a matter of course, yes, I do think that's the case.
Getting back to Ambassador Sondland, you testified that every now and then he made a habit of name-dropping his interactions with the president.
That's correct, yes.
And I believe you also told us that there were instances where you would run into him on the campus and he would say, oh, I'm here to see the president, or I've been in to see the president, and you had an occasion to circle back and found out that wasn't the case?
That's correct.
And I just want to give you an opportunity. He testified about some sort of coffee he had with you On your last day, and I think when the deposition transcript was released, your counsel indicated that that was completely fabricated on Ambassador Sondland's part, and I just want to give you an opportunity to address that.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, this is the federal government. We don't have coffee machines, readily in our office. If you'd come to my office in that time, the best I could have offered you was a cup of water from the water fountain outside of my office. Mm-hmm. So, the coffee that Ambassador Sondland and I shared was actually, we ran into each other, or rather he found out I was going to be there and then asked me to meet him for coffee in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in 2018 in August. So this is a full year before I left. Now, it was a very nice coffee, so perhaps he, conflated those two meetings together. The meeting that he was referring to, he had come in to meet with our director for the European Union. This was in my last week in the office. And as I was in the office at the same time for a brief period before going into another meeting, and it was my last week in the office, we agreed to sit down with the director of the European Union, with actually Colonel Vindman, and the assistant that Ambassador Sondland had brought with him from the State Department. So there were actually 4 of us in that meeting, and unfortunately it wasn't over coffee.
And, he went on to indicate that you were upset, and you were upset with
Actually,
Ambassador...
there were 5 of us really in the meeting. Obviously, I can't do math, sorry.
Fair enough. He indicated you were upset, and you were upset with Ambassador Bolton, and upset with the way things are going, and I believe your counsel said that was an outright fabrication.
Well, I think you might recall in my deposition on October 14th that I said that very unfortunately I had a bit of a blow-up with Ambassador Sondland, and I had a couple of testy encounters with him. One of those was in June 18, when I actually said to him, "Who put you in charge of Ukraine?" And, I'll admit I was a bit rude, and that's when he told me the president, which shut me up. And this other meeting, it was about 15, 20 minutes, exactly as he depicted it was. I was actually, to be honest, angry with him. And, I hate to say it, but often when women show anger, it's not fully appreciated. It's often, pushed onto emotional issues, perhaps, or deflected onto other people. And what I was angry about was that he wasn't coordinating with us. Now, I actually realized, having listened to his deposition, that he was absolutely right, that he wasn't coordinating with us because we weren't doing the same thing that he was doing. So I was upset with him that he wasn't fully telling us about all of the meetings that he was having. And he said to me, "But I'm briefing the president. I'm briefing Chief of Staff Mulvaney. I'm briefing Secretary Pompeo, and I've talked to Ambassador Bolton. Who else do I have to deal with?" And the point is we have a robust interagency process that deals with Ukraine. It includes Mr. Holmes. It includes Ambassador Taylor as the chargé in Ukraine. It includes a whole load of other people. But it struck me yesterday when you put up on the screen Ambassador Sondland's emails and who was on these emails, and he said, "These are the people who need to know," that he was absolutely right, because he was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged. So he was correct, and I had not put my finger on that at the moment, but I was irritated with him and angry with him that he wasn't fully coordinating. And I did say to him, "Ambassador Sondland, Gordon, I think this is all going to blow up," and here we are. And after I left to my next meeting, our director for the European Union talked to him much further for a full half hour or more later, trying to ask him about how we could coordinate better, or how others could coordinate better after I had left the office. And his feeling was that the National Security Council was always trying to block him. What we were trying to do was block us from straying into domestic or personal politics. And that was precisely what I was trying to do. But Ambassador Sondland is not wrong that he had been given a different remit than we had been. And it was at that moment that I started to realize how those things had diverged. And I realized, in fact, that I wasn't really being fair to Ambassador Sondland, because he was carrying out what he thought he had been instructed to carry out, and we were doing something that we thought was just as, or perhaps even more important, but it wasn't in the same channel.
Yeah, Dr. Hill, if you mind, yes, sir, sorry. Dr. Hill, I just want to drill down on this a little bit. The President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief, was concerned about the 2016 elections in Burisma. He had his personal attorney working these issues because he was under investigation by Robert Mueller's special counsel, partly beginning with an investigation that started with the Steele dossier that we've already established that the Democrats had paid for and had then fed into the FBI. So at the end of the day, the commander-in-chief, concerned about 2016 election meddling by Ukraine, sounds like you had just earlier testified that you weren't aware of that, but if that was the concern of the president, to try to get to the bottom of it, and it's the concern of Ambassador Sondland, who was trying to set up meetings on behalf of, to ensure really that meetings occurred and phone calls occurred to strengthen the relationship. I understand the people at the NSC, people at the State Department had issues with that, but at the end of the day, isn't it the commander-in-chief that makes those decisions?
My point, Mr. Nunes, is that we at the National Security Council were not told, either by the President directly or through Ambassador Bolton, that we were to be focused on these issues as a matter of US foreign policy toward Ukraine. So when you're talking about Ukraine in 2016, I never personally heard the President say anything specific about 2016 in Ukraine. I've seen him saying plenty of things publicly, but I was not given a directive. In fact, I was given a directive on July 10th by Ambassador Bolton very clearly to stay out of domestic politics.
And just for sake of the timeline, I think as of July 19th, they hadn't even engaged with Rudy Giuliani yet. I don't believe that happened until a little bit later. So you believe by July 19th they were already engaged in those types of activities?
We had already had a discussion with Kurt Volker, which was in the depositions of his assistant, Chris Anderson, that indicated that he had met with Rudy Giuliani at this point. And Ambassador Sondland made comments about meeting with Giuliani. And as we know, in the May 23rd meeting, they had been instructed to meet with Giuliani. Right. They gave us every impression that they were meeting with Rudy Giuliani at this point, and Rudy Giuliani was also saying on the television, and indeed has said subsequently, that he was closely coordinating with the State Department. Okay, so it was my belief that they were meeting with him.
Okay, and there's some ambiguity in the direction to work with Rudy Giuliani. Ambassador Volker said the president dismissed Ukraine and said, oh, if you want to work on it, just go talk to Rudy. And Ambassador Sondland took that a little bit differently. And I believe that Ambassador Volker was primarily the interlocutor with Mr. Giuliani, and that was happening, didn't start until the end of July.
I only learned that subsequently from Ambassador Volker's deposition. So I just want to tell you in that particular time frame, I was not aware of that. And in fact, Gordon Sondland did refer to Rudy Giuliani. And again, Ambassador Bolton had warned Ambassador Volker not to meet with Rudy Giuliani in a meeting.
Mr. Morrison told us both in his deposition and his public hearing that you had related concerns about Colonel Vindman's judgment.
I did not relate any concerns in general terms about Colonel Vindman's judgment, so I was somewhat surprised when I heard Mr. Morrison make that assertion and when I read his deposition. There was a very specific point that was made, and again, these are personnel issues, and I'm sure that nobody here would like to have their private personnel issues put before a committee, but you've asked me about this. So I had a couple of very short transition meetings with Mr. Morrison. And again, Mr. Morrison did not work in our directorate. He was taking over the position, which he held for 3 months. I had worked as the director, the senior director for Europe and Eurasia, it was at the time, for more than 2 years at this point, and I'd been working for a year with Colonel Vindman, with Mr. Vindman. And in the course of one of the meetings, sometime in the June timeframe, I sat down with Mr. Morrison and with a deputy, referred to him in his deposition, John Erith, who was also working, and we went through our organizational chart. We went through who was staying, who was rotating out and leaving in the summer, and we talked about everybody's strengths and weaknesses. And I always asked my staff to do upward feedback as well, to talk about what I wasn't doing right either. I'd like to learn too. And I said that I was concerned about the way things were trending in Ukraine policy. So Colonel Vindman is a highly distinguished, decorated military officer. He came over to us from the chairman's office and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we were evaluating and looking at him in the context of what his future positions would be in the context of the US Army. And I was concerned that if, for example, Colonel Vindman might decide to leave the military, that perhaps he wasn't as well suited for something that would be much more political. I did not feel that he had the political antenna to deal with something that was straying into domestic politics. Not everyone is suited for that. That does not mean in any way that I was questioning his overall judgment, nor was I questioning in any way his substantive expertise. He is excellent on issues related to Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, on Russian defense issues. He had been in charge of the Russia campaign, thinking through at the chairman's office and in the Pentagon. This was a very specific issue because by June, we saw that things were diverging and you needed a completely different sensitivity. Some people in my office have worked at the highest levels of advisory positions, and Mr. Morrison had come from Capitol Hill. He knew politics inside out, and we said that Colonel Vindman did not, and we were concerned about how he would manage what was becoming a highly charged and potentially partisan issue, which had not been before.
And Colonel Vindman related to us during his deposition that he subsequently was sort of cut out of a lot of the decision-making and involvements with the embassy in Ukraine. Was that something you recommended?
Not with the embassy in Ukraine. I mean, we did pull him back from the meeting in May in the Oval Office. And subsequently, we were very concerned about these political aspects to this. And we did not feel, when July 10th, Colonel Vindman was justifiably alarmed when he realized that there was this highly political aspect of the meeting that we were looking for eventually with President Zelensky.
And Mr. Holmes, I want to, at the end of August, we understand that Ambassador Taylor was engaged in obtaining some information for the president about European allies' burden sharing in the region as the decision about aid was being debated.
So, sir, after the hold was placed on the security assistance, and many people, I think, were scrambling to try to understand why. I believe it was Senator Johnson who had said that the president was concerned about burden sharing, perhaps others as well. And so trying to interpret why this might have happened, and we were looking into the facts of what the Europeans have provided and what we have provided. It's very illuminating what we learned. The United States has provided combined civilian and assistance to Ukraine since 2014 of about $3 billion plus two $1 billion loan guarantees. That's not, those get paid back largely. So just over $3 billion. The Europeans, at the level of the European Union plus the member states combined since 2014, my understanding, have provided a combined $12 billion to Ukraine.
And you were able to communicate that information back at the end of August?
I believe so. Yeah, this is done in collaboration with other missions to the EU, to NATO, and others. Yes.
And do you think that was the information the White House was looking for?
We don't know. If the concern was that that others weren't spending as much as we were to support Ukraine, then that information showed a different story.
Okay. And the aid was subsequently lifted. The pause in the aid was lifted shortly thereafter.
It was in early September, in mid-September.
Yield back.
That concludes the 45-minute rounds. We'll now go to member questioning. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. First, as a threshold matter, I want to say to the witnesses to be a bit cautious when members represent. Are you aware of this fact? Are you aware of that fact? Do you know that so-and-so testified to this or testified to that? If you have personal knowledge of it, that's fine. I'm not saying this is deliberate. Sometimes members get it wrong. So let me just clear the record on one of the things that was suggested to you, that the Vice President canceled his trip because of a conflict with the trip to Canada. That was not Ms. Williams' testimony. Her testimony was, I asked my colleague why we should stop trip planning and why the Vice President would not be attending, and I was informed that the President had decided the Vice President would not attend the inauguration. So just offer that caution. Dr. Hill, I want to ask you, you may be aware of some of the attacks on Colonel Vindman. suggesting that he has a dual loyalty, that he's not really loyal to America, he's loyal to Ukraine. I wanted to ask you, as a fellow immigrant, what you think of those kind of accusations when they're leveled against Colonel Vindman or other Americans.
I think it's very unfortunate. I mean, this is a country of immigrants, you know, with the exception, you know, perhaps of very few people still here. Everyone immigrated to the United States at some point in their family history. And this is what, for me, really does make America great. I mean, I'm sure that every single person here, some people perhaps came reluctantly, others came by choice, as I did. But this is, for me, this is the essence of America. It's why I wanted to be here and why I wanted to stay here. And I think it's unfair to castigate anyone. Everyone has some kind of appellate to them. I'm an Anglo-American, perhaps, then, or I'm a British American, I'm a naturalized citizen. I do not believe that my loyalty is to the United Kingdom. My loyalty is here to the United States. This is my country and the country that I serve. And I know for a fact that every single one of my colleagues, and there were many naturalized citizens in my office and across the National Security Council, felt exactly the same way. I think it's deeply unfair.
Thank you. You mentioned something in your testimony, I might not have this exactly right, that I think Ambassador Sondland at one point told you his role was to make deals. Is that right?
That's correct.
And
he told other people that as well, to be clear.
I want to ask you about one of those deals, the one that Ambassador Bolton described as a drug deal. I had the suggestion, or the indication rather, when Mr. Goldman was asking questions about the July 10th meeting, and in fact there were two meetings, one Ambassador Bolton's presence and then another in the wardroom, that there was more you had to say about that. Do you want to walk us through that in a little more detail?
Well, the reference that Ambassador Bolton made was after I returned from the wardroom and related to him what I had heard. Because so there was sequencing of meetings, which I know that there's been some concern about the sequencing here and discrepancies between various depositions. So what happened immediately after the meeting that Ambassador Bolton caught a little short was that he told me to hold back in the room. And he was escorting out the Ukrainian visitors, along with Secretary Perry and Ambassadors Volker and Sondland. And I guess they wanted to take a quick photograph outside of his office. And I know that Secretary Perry and others have tweeted out that photograph, beautiful sunny day, and there's a picture of all of them standing just outside of Ambassador Bolton's office. This was very quick. He came back in. And at that point, I guess they were already moving down to the wardroom, because on the way out of Ambassador Bolton's office, Ambassador Sondland had said, let's regroup in the wardroom for, you know, quick huddle on next steps, which, to be honest, was quite unusual. You don't usually huddle in a room in the White House to discuss next steps with foreign delegations, because we took it to be next steps on setting up the meeting, which already, as I'd said, Ambassador Bolton wasn't prepared to do. And when Ambassador Bolton came back into the office, that's when he gave me the very strong instruction to go downstairs, find out what was being discussed, and to come right back up and report it to him. And as I came into the wardroom, Alex Vindman, Colonel Vindman, and Ambassador Sondland were in an exchange, and that's when I noticed that Colonel Vindman looked quite alarmed. Now, I know that Ambassador Sondland was asked yesterday, because again, I watched all of his testimony, and I watched it very carefully, that there were some questions about yelling and shouting. I certainly never said that, and there was no yelling and shouting. That's some embellishment that's crept in, perhaps in media depictions, or how people like to retell these stories and add things to them. When I came in, Ambassador Sondland was in an exchange with Colonel Vindman, along the lines of, well, we have an agreement to have this meeting. And I came in and I asked, what's going on here? And he said, and this is again, the Ukrainians are there, Ambassador Volker was there, but at this point, I also want to stress, Secretary Perry had left. He was not in the wardroom when I came. As I was coming in, Secretary Perry and his colleagues were leaving. So Secretary Perry has no recollection of this meeting because he was not in it. And so when I came in, Gordon Sondland was basically saying, well, look, we have a deal here that there will be a meeting. I have a deal here with Chief of Staff Mulvaney. There will be a meeting if the Ukrainians open up or announce these investigations into 2016 in Burisma. And I cut it off immediately there. because by this point, having heard Mr. Giuliani over and over again on the television and all of the issues that he was asserting, by this point it was clear that Burisma was code for the Bidens, because Giuliani was laying it out there. I could see why Colonel Vindman was alarmed, and he said, this is inappropriate, we're the National Security Council, we can't be involved in this. And I've learned, since from Mr. Holmes's rendition here today, that Colonel Vindman had already warned the Ukrainians, or in fact President Zelensky, no less, to stay out of American politics, domestic politics. So I cut off this line and I said to Ambassador Sondland, look, we need procedures for here. Ambassador Bolton just made it clear we can't set up the meeting right now. We have to properly prepare this through the proper process. I know this sounds all very boring, but we have national security procedures to do this. And I said, we really shouldn't be litigating this or talking about this in front of our colleagues from Ukraine. It was completely inappropriate for us to be thrashing this out in front of them. And he agreed, and we asked our Ukrainian colleagues to move into the corridor outside the wardroom. And I explained where this is in the deposition, which was also extraordinarily awkward, because they shouldn't have been standing around in a corridor in the, basically in the West Wing at this particular juncture. And that's when I pushed back on Ambassador Sondland and said, look, I know there's differences about when we should have this meeting. We're trying to figure out whether we should have it after the Ukrainian parliamentary elections, the Rada elections, which by that point I think had been set for July 21st. It must have been, because this is July 10th at this point. And Ambassador Bolton would like to wait until after that to basically see whether President Zelensky gets a majority in the parliament, which would enable him to form a cabinet, and then we can move forward. And Ambassador Sondland then said, okay, fair enough. He realized he wasn't going to be able to push this further. Ambassador Volker didn't say anything at this particular juncture. And then he said he had another meeting, and they all left. And I went back up and relayed this to Ambassador Bolton, which is when he gave me the very specific instruction that we've already been through, to go to talk to Mr. Eisenberg, John Eisenberg, in the NSC Council's office.
Thank you. Mr. Nunes.
I assume we're getting 8 minutes there?
Mr. Nunes, I don't cut off a witness in the middle of their answer. You may proceed.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Holmes, why didn't your boss talk about it?
What's that, sir?
Why didn't your boss bring up the call that you overheard? The reason you're here today. I mean, you're their closing witness, yet their star witness, their first witness, Ambassador Taylor, didn't even bring it up. And when we deposed you, you said this was extremely distinctive experience, one of the most remarkable events of my life. You described it like this. You said, after the call happens, I immediately told Deputy Chief of Mission and others at the embassy about the call. Then you said you went on vacation. You told several friends and family about the call. Then you come back on August 6th, and you tell Ambassador Taylor about the call. And then in your deposition statement, you said in your statement today as well, I repeatedly referred to the call in meetings and conversations where the issue of the president's interest in Ukraine was relevant. I repeatedly referred to the call in meetings and conversations where the issue of the president's interest in Ukraine was relevant. That sounds like government speak for you. Told everybody. Yet their star witness, their first witness, Ambassador Taylor, when he came here, he related 13 different conversations he had between July 18th when the aid is frozen, September 11th when it's released. 13 different conversations, never once mentioning this call. July 19th, Dr. Hill and Colonel Vindman told Taylor what Sondland told them. July 19th, Sondland told Taylor about the upcoming Trump-Zelensky call. July 20th, Sondland told Taylor what Sondland told Zelensky to tell Trump. July 20th, Dana Look tells Taylor what Zelensky told Dana Look. July 28th, Morrison tells Taylor what happened on the Trump-Zelensky call. August 16th, Volker tells Taylor what Yarmak told Volker. August 21st, Breckbull talks to Taylor. August 22nd, Morrison talks to Taylor. August 29th, Yarmak talks to Taylor. September 1st, Morrison tells Taylor what Sondland told Morrison about what Yarmak told Sondland. September 2nd, Morrison tells Taylor what Dana Look told Morrison. September 7th, Morrison tells Taylor what Sondland told Trump. And September 8th, Sondland tells Taylor what Trump told Sondland. Nowhere is there a Holmes tells Taylor what the President of the United States told Sondland.
May I answer that
13
question?
conversations. Yeah, I'll get to you. I'll give you a chance here in a second. But 13 conversations from their star witness. You're their closing witness, and he can't remember a call from a guy he works with every single day. Why?
Yes, sir. So, 13 conversations from their star witness, you're their closing witness, and he can't remember a call from a guy he works with every single day. Why? Yes, sir. So, 13 conversations from their star witness, you're their closing witness, and he can't remember a call from a guy he works with every single day. Why? Immediately when I went back to the embassy after this, this lunch on the 26th, I told my direct supervisor, the deputy chief of mission, I would have told Ambassador Taylor immediately, except he was on the front lines that afternoon. I then went on, as I testified, my vacation on Saturday, came back the following Monday, and on Tuesday, I was back in the ambassador's office where I referred to the call. In that week plus that I was away, it was my assumption that the deputy chief of mission would have informed other people about the call as well. So my recollection is when I did refer to the call in that meeting that Ambassador Taylor nodded knowingly as though he had been briefed on it. So I referred to the call and I mentioned some of my takeaways from the call. And at the time, the main takeaway from the call was the president doesn't care about Ukraine. So we're going to have a tough road ahead to convince him that it's important enough for him to schedule an Oval Office meeting for President Zelensky and ultimately to release this hold on security assistance. That was the takeaway. And that's what I referred to repeatedly in the coming weeks whenever it became relevant. And I'll remind you, sir, that one more important point. Throughout this time, as I've testified, we were trying to find a formula, things we could do with the Ukrainians that would convince the president that they were worth talking to.
Maybe Mr. Holmes, the takeaway was he thought it was no big deal because he already knew. He didn't remember it because we already had the transcript.
No,
He didn't remember the we had the Trump-Zelensky transcript had been out for 2 months.
Sir, I believe that
Even though you're repeatedly bringing this conversation up, as you said, to everybody anytime there's a talk about Ukraine, you recall this conversation. Maybe it was the transcript. The call happened on the July 25th. That's 4 months ago. The transcript's been out for 2 months. Maybe the ambassador thought this is nothing new here. But Shazam, last week you come forward with supposedly this new information. There is nothing different in there than what we had on the transcript. Maybe that's the reason their star witness, their first witness, didn't bring it up. But they had to have something. So you're their closing witness because you overheard the president talking to Ambassador Sondland.
Sir, if I could answer, I see 4 seconds left on the clock. I believe that
Mr. Holmes, you may take as long as you need.
Thank you, sir. I believe that Ambassador Taylor did already know when I briefed him when I returned from vacation on the 6th. It was not news to him that the president was pressing for a Biden investigation.
That's not what I asked. I asked why he didn't share with us.
Mr. Jordan, please do not interrupt the witness any further. Mr. Holmes,
this is exactly
Mr. Jordan's time has expired, but yours has not.
Okay, thank you,
You may
sir.
answer the question.
It's exactly my point. I briefed the call in detail to the deputy chief of mission, went away for a week, come back, I refer to the call, and everyone is nodding. Of course that's what's going on. Of course the president is pressing for a Biden investigation before he'll do these things the Ukrainians want. There was nodding agreement. So did I go through every single word in the call? No, because everyone by that point agreed. It was obvious what the president was pressing for. And Ambassador Taylor, as you've just outlined, had all those other interactions with
But he
all
didn't
these other
share it
people.
with us.
Mr. Jordan, please do not interrupt.
But sir, then, but sir, my vivid recollection of an event I was involved with was a touchstone experience that to me validated
And
what, sir,
Mr.
if I could
Jordan,
finish,
please do
what
not
we
interrupt.
believed. And Ambassador Taylor was not in that call.
And so all of a sudden last week, you got to come tell us, right?
Mr.
Even
Jordan,
though your
we
boss
will
wouldn't.
allow the witness to answer the question.
I'll finish with this.
Thank you.
He was involved in a number of other interactions, as you outlined, that brought him to the same conclusion. It is quite possible that
But he doesn't share the one that the guy he worked with.
Mr. Jordan,
He doesn't share
Mr.
that one.
Jordan, you may not like the witness's answer, but we
No,
will hear it.
there wasn't an answer. It's a
Mr.
filibuster.
Jordan, we will hear the witness's answer. Have you concluded, Mr. Holmes?
I have, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hill and Mr. Holmes, thank you for your testimony. Dr. Hill, you made a fairly dramatic comment in your opening statement to which the ranking member took some exception. I'm more interested in the Ukraine piece of this, but you said some of you on this committee appear to believe that Russian security services did not conduct a campaign against our country and that perhaps somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. I'm really much more interested in the Ukraine piece of this, but I do want to defend you briefly. I don't know what my colleagues believe, but I do have a pretty good sense of what the effects are of creating ambiguity, of lacking clarity and conviction around the Russian attack on the election of 2016. In response to your comment, The ranking member offered up a report which varies in material respects from the report that was created by the 17 agencies of the intelligence community. A day does not go by in which ranking member Nunes does not speak of the Russia hoax. And this is an area in which context is pretty important. Dr. Hill, let me read you a comment by another senior official. Why did Democratic National Committee turn down the DHS offer to protect against hacks? It's all a big Dem hoax, all caps. Why did the DNC refuse to turn over its server to the FBI? It's all a big Dem scam. Dr. Hill, do you know who said those things?
I don't.
That's the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. So you might be forgiven
I might have
for your...
missed that.
Yeah, you didn't miss much. But my point is, and tell me if you agree or disagree, ambiguity, a failure to name and shame the Russians for the attack in 2016, that is not in the service of our national security, is it?
It's not, no.
It's not. So let's turn to Ukraine. Dr. Hill, have you seen you characterized the idea that Ukraine interfered in the election as a fictional narrative. Have you seen any evidence at all that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election?
Well, I brought with me two exhibits that I was pointed to, in fact, by our colleagues during the deposition that I gave on October 14th. And actually, I'm quite grateful that they pointed me in this direction. I was presented during my deposition with two articles, or at least two pieces of information. One was an op-ed that the Ukrainian ambassador, Charlie, wrote in 2016 in The Hill. So this is during the presidential campaign when President Trump was then the nominee for the Republican Party. And this is Ambassador Charlie, who was then, still the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, being critical of President Trump, who was then the nominee for the Republican Party, for making comments about Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia.
May I interrupt you there? Let me be very specific about what those comments were. The president, when he was a candidate, said, quote, "The people of Crimea, from what I've heard, would rather be with Russia than where they were." So Ambassador Charlie is responding to that in that article, correct?
That's correct, and he just uses this as a peg because, to be honest, the whole article is actually about Ukraine. And this is classic standard for anyone who wants to write an op-ed. I've written plenty of them myself. You pick a peg by something that you or somebody else might have said, and then you proceed to say what you want to say.
Right, so here it is.
This is what Ambassador Charlie does, is he talks about Ukraine's position vis-a-vis Russia and Russian aggression against Ukraine.
Yeah, and let me just read, because it's worth people hearing what this severe attack on candidate Trump, who has suggested that the Crimeans would rather be with Russia. Ambassador Charlie writes, "Even if Trump's comments are only speculative and do not really reflect a future foreign policy, they call for appeasement of an aggressor and support the violation of a sovereign country's territorial integrity and another's breach of international law." Dun, dun, dun. That's the attack on candidate Trump. Does that sound like election interference to you?
Well, I would say that it's probably not the most advisable thing to do for an ambassador because you never know who's going to win. And I think that the second piece that was presented to me at great length, and I want to thank Mr. Castor for making me go back and read it again, because when you asked me the questions about it, I did remember the piece. Kenneth Vogel is a very well-known and, as you've pointed out, extremely good journalist. And I'd remembered reading this back in the day in January of 2017, but it had been a long time between then and October. And you gave me a copy, and I went back and read it again, because I think it actually is extraordinarily important. It gets to this issue here. Mr. Vogel points out that the Ukrainian government, again, they wouldn't have done very well at the bookies, picking up the issue I pointed out at the beginning of today. They bet on the wrong horse. They bet on Hillary Clinton winning the election. And so, they were trying to curry favor with the Clinton campaign. It's quite evident here. And he relates, to some extent, individuals and some Ukrainian officials, like Mr. Avakov, the Interior Minister, and a number of other people that he names here and that have been named at various points, and talks about how they were trying to collect information, as Ranking Member Nunes said, on Mr. Manafort and on other people as well. However, I do want to point out that the crux of the article here by Mr. Vogel is he said there was little evidence of a top-down effort by Ukraine. And he makes a distinction between the Russian effort that was personally directed by Russian President Putin and involved the country's military and foreign intelligence services. Now, I don't think that those two things are exactly the same. I also mentioned in my deposition of October 14th that, in fact, many officials from many countries, including Ukraine, bet on the wrong horse. They believed that Secretary Clinton, former Senator Clinton, former First Lady Clinton was going to win. And many said some pretty disparaging and hurtful things about President Trump, and I can't blame him for feeling aggrieved about them. And when we were setting up head of state visits, and I remember I have a portfolio of 50-plus countries, plus NATO and the European Union, we thought it prudent to collect as much as possible about comments that people might have said about the president during the campaign when he was either one of the candidates to be the nominee for the Republican Party, or when he was actually the candidate running against Hillary Clinton. And I'm sorry to say that an awful lot, and perhaps I shouldn't name them here because it will have consequences, an awful lot of senior officials in many governments, including our allied governments, said some pretty hurtful things about the president. And I would also personally take offense at some of the things that were said if I were the president. Now, the difference here, however, is that that hasn't had any major impact on his feelings towards those countries. Not that I have seen. But I've also heard the president say, and he said, so I'm not